everyone. I welcome you to the CEC lecture series. I'm Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University. And today's lecture is part of the ongoing series on English drama. The lecture title is Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. And for those of you who are associated with literature, you would have come across this title, you would have come across the words Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and I'm sure it would ring a bell. Now, these words, of course, must be familiar to anybody who has read Shakespeare's Hamlet. But of course, when we look at the title, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, this is the title of a play which is written in 1966 by Tom Stoppard. So today's lecture is going to be a discussion about this seminal play of the 60s and, what are its thematic concerns, what is the link of this play to Shakespeare, and why, do we have the names of Shakespearean characters as part of the play's title. So all these things will be in discussion today. Now, first, let's look at, let's know a bit about the playwright, that is Tom Stoppard. Now, he is a Czech-born British playwright and also a screenwriter. Screenwriter, somebody who writes for, who writes screenplays for the films, right? And his work, covers the themes of human rights, censorship, and political freedom. And he often also delves into the deeper political questions of society, right? So that's what Tom Stoppard does, and he of course writes in English. So if you can see on screen, that is Tom Stoppard, and he was born in 1937, and he is alive at the moment as well. So he's about 85 years of age, and he has done some seminal work. He has written some very popular and critically acclaimed plays, one of which, of course, is in discussion today, that is Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. Then the other plays include Jumpers, which was written in 1972. In 1974, he wrote the play Travesties. And as I said that, he has written a lot of plays, and along with that, he also has written a lot of screenplays. Now, screenplays for the films such as The Russia House, he wrote it in 1990. This very popular film that we all are aware of, Shakespeare in Love, the screenplay for that was also written by Stoppard in 1998, and he also wrote a screenplay for this very famous 19th century Russian novel, that is Anna Karenina. So the film adaptation of that novel carries the screenplay by Tom Stoppard, and this he did in 2012. Now, these were, of course, just to tell you what has he done so far, because apart from this, he has written various other screenplays and plays as well. So this tells us that how prolific Stoppard has been, and about his engagement with literature and its adaptation for the screen. So what we notice here is that the idea of adaptation is somewhat central to Stoppard's aesthetic. Okay. For instance, even the play which is in discussion today is some kind of a adaptation of Shakespeare to the 1960s context, right? And we see that how he also writes, he has written screenplays which are for the films, which are adaptations of different books, right? So for somebody who's interested, might want to study the question of adaptation vis-a-vis Stoppard still more. Apart from this, we've also seen that Stoppard has been a playwright of the National Theatre, and he is also one of the most internationally performed dramatists of his generation. He was also knighted for his contribution to theatre by Queen Elizabeth II in 1997. So we see that how Stoppard is quite an acclaimed literary figure who was active during the 60s, 70s, 80s onwards, and all these decades he engaged with playwriting and screenwriting. Now, coming to the play which is in discussion today, that is Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, the date is 1966, and it was first performed at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in, as I just now said, 1966. That's when it was first staged. Now, what we say about the play is also that it is an absurdist existential tragi-comedy. Now, I'm using three very important words here: absurdist, existential, tragi-comedy. Now, let's first look at the most obvious word here, which is tragi-comedy. We see that the word tragi-comedy is a combination of tragic and comedy, right? So, this shows that a play which has elements of both the comic as well as the tragic, right? Such a play is referred to as a tragi-comedy. Now, you might wonder that how is it possible that a play is both tragic and comic at the same time, right? So it's not entirely tragic or it's not entirely comic. So one can say that perhaps a play is dealing with, that aspect of human life which is unpalatable, or let's say, a slightly challenging aspect of human life. But then that issue is dealt with some kind of a humor. Okay, so very fundamentally speaking, that is what would comprise a tragicomedy. Now, the other two words are absurdist, existential. Now, absurdist play we call Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead as an absurdist play because it belongs to the literary movement of the theatre of the absurd, right? Now, what is this movement about? What are the works that were written at this time? What are its features is something that we're going to look at in just a bit, right? And existential is actually a philosophy which kind of drove the texts which were written under this movement of absurdism that flourished in Europe after the Second World War, right? So that's what we mean if you look at the terms, that this play is an absurdist, existential tragicomedy. So we are going to develop more about, and actually discuss more about absurdist and existential in just a bit. The other thing that we also need to be aware of about the play is that it is based on Shakespeare's tragedy Hamlet. So I would urge that those of you who would want to read this, a play, you must also read Hamlet for once. And reading the two plays together then, becomes a very fruitful literary exercise in adaptation, where you can understand a lot of things, you can get a lot of insights by means of comparison, etc. Right? So now, when I say that it is based on Shakespeare's tragedy Hamlet, it's not enough to say that, but particularly we must understand that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead display is a kind of a rewriting of Hamlet in the 1960s. Now, Hamlet, of course, we know was written in the end of the 17th century, right? So around end of the 15th or the 16th century, around the end of the 16th century, or maybe the beginning of the 17th, right? So tragedies, of course, Shakespeare's tragedies are slightly later in chronology then. So something which was written at that time during the Elizabethan age, 16th, 17th century, that is being adapted in the 1960s context, which is the 20th century. So we need to see that to what end is the playwright doing this? Why does he pick up an element of an Elizabethan play to be represented in the 60s? So that is something which we must keep in mind as we enter the text, right? Now, before I go ahead and talk about the text in still further detail, it's important for us to also see that how this play was very, very popular. It was popularly staged. There are various, very, very famous stagings of the play. There have also been film adaptations of the play. So as you can see on your screens, this is a poster of a film which was made out of the play Rosencrantz, Guildenstern Are Dead. So this basically tells us that what kind of an appeal this text has had. It has actually, captured the imaginations of a lot of people. Now, coming back to the point that I was making about this text, that is, it belongs to the theatre of the absurd. Now, what is that? It is actually a literary movement which emerged in France after the Second World War. And what's the duration of the Second World War? 1939 to 45. So basically in the years after the war, which is after 1945, this play, this movement started to flourish. And this was actually a rebellion against all that was considered normative, or all the features which were associated with human beings. That is, how human beings are rational creatures. They live in a society which has a sense of order, right? There is some kind of a logic to life. There's a pattern to human life and human action. So all these certitudes then were kind of called to question after the Second World War, and we see this reflected in the theatre of the absurd as well, right? So this becomes one of the central concerns of the theatre of the absurd, which came into being after the Second World War. So we also see that what are the features, particular features belonging to, of the works belonging to this movement, right? So what they have now, all the works which are associated with theatre of the absurd, they have in common the view that the human condition is essentially absurd. Absurd meaning strange, something which is difficult to pin down, right? So that's the common view which exists in all the works belonging to this movement, that the human condition is essentially absurd, and that this condition can be adequately expressed only in works of literature that are themselves absurd, right? So this belief that human life is absurd, there is no logic to it, it is difficult to pin it down to certain recognizable patterns, this absurdity, or this sense of absurdity about human life, which had emerged as a result of the Second World War, was believed to be represented, or it was believed that such absurdity can be represented in works which are equally absurd, right? So which means what? That the form of writings, of all the literature that was belonging to this movement then would be very unconventional, right? Now you might wonder that why is it that after the Second World War this kind of an understanding or this kind of a view of human nature emerged. Now you see, this was a time during the Second World War, if you read up about it a bit, you will see that there was the war at a point of time had come at such a head where, of course, the entire world was fighting amongst one another. One country was at the throat of the other, etc. But what exactly was the reason for this war? Nobody knew, right? The only factor which was known was that there is a war that is going on. But for what purpose? What was the reason? Who was ranged against whom? Why was there enmity? Who were the central players? Who was supporting whom? Why were countries changing sides and allegiances? All this was, a blur at that time. So this is just one kind of an absurdity which was unleashed at the time of the Second World War, and that is how this question came to surface. That how human condition then itself perhaps is equally illogical, right? Human beings that can engage in such an event that is so difficult to unravel or to untangle, in that sense, to even pin it down. That is what gave rise to this feeling of disconnectedness and absurdity amongst human race as well, right? Now, so this is what the movement is about. As I had mentioned before, that Theatre of the Absurd is a European movement which has texts from France, England, of course, and different parts of Europe, right? Now, the other thing that we also say, and if you remember when we were describing the play, we said that it's a absurdist existential tragic comedy. Now, existential, what is it? As I said, it's a philosophy. Now, at the heart of the movement of the Theatre of the Absurd is this existential philosophy, which is very commonly associated with Jean-Paul Sartre of France and Albert Camus. Right? Now, whenever you talk about existentialism, these two names would foremost come up in discussion. Again, we don't have a lot of time, so I would ask you to read up more about Sartre and Camus' thoughts. But to know what exactly existentialism is or existential philosophy entails, first it views human beings as essentially alone in this world, right? Instead of viewing humans or man as a social being in harmony and in cooperation with his or her fellow beings, instead this philosophy views human beings as being alone, right? And at the same time, the next thing that this philosophy also views is that human beings are cast in a meaningless universe. So the universe in which human beings are operating lacks meaning, okay? The world which surrounds people has no inherent logic or meaning or truth. This is the third, kind of assumption of existential philosophy. Then it says that human life is also seen as a fruitless search for meaning and purpose. Now, what do we mean by fruitless search for meaning and purpose? Basically, that if an individual, starts out to understand the meaning of life, to understand the purpose of life, why do we exist? Why do we do what we do? That search, according to existential philosophy, is going to be fruitless. Why? Because there's no meaning, there's no purpose, there's no logic to human life according to this philosophy. Now you see, this kind of a thought process was directly the result of the socio-political conditions of the time after the Second World War. All right. Now, to sum this up, this idea of existential philosophy, we must look at what Albert Camus says in his text titled "The Myths of the Sisyphus." He says, and I quote, "In a universe that is suddenly deprived of illusions and light, man feels a stranger. His is an irremediable exile. The divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, truly constitutes the feeling of absurdity," unquote. So this is a very important quotation which carries different ideas that sum up this philosophy very well. So first is that man feels a stranger in this world. Why? Because there's no hope, because there's nothing positive, because everything around is, seen to be going down to dregs, right? So there's no hope, and therefore man feels a stranger. He does not feel a sense of belonging to the world. So therefore he says that it's a kind of an exile. Camus calls it an exile, right? The other important point that he makes over here is that there's a divorce between man and his life, right? Divorce between man and his life means that there is no connection between the individual and the life which that individual lives. Okay, there's no connection. One cannot, draw the dots. One cannot talk about any logic about which operates between an individual and the world that he inhabits. And also, he says that there is a divorce between the actor and his setting. What is setting? Surroundings, right? So it's a metaphor. That existentialism is that philosophy which sees that how when an actor is alienated from his setting, right? And this kind of a disconnect between the individual and the universe, individual and the world, individual and meaning, individual and logic, all this constitutes the feeling of absurdity. That how human condition essentially is absurd. There is no sense to it, right? Now let's again not forget that this thought process came up at a particular point in history, which was during the Second World War, actually after the Second World War. So we see that how these historical events have a very decisive influence on human thought, okay? And that's how different philosophies come into being at different points of time. Now, if we look at the formal elements of the theatre of the absurd, we have seen what theatre of the absurd is, what this literary movement does. What is the philosophy behind it? Now we see how does it play out in literature. So looking at the formal elements of the plays which mirror this absurdity, the first feature, you will see that there is an absence of logic, right? It will be difficult for you to find the logic of why something happens after, let's say, why B takes place after A. There's going to be no reason behind what happens in the text. Second, there's also a lack of coherence in plot and language. That's the second feature of plays that mirror this absurdity. Third, the familiar becomes grotesque. Grotesque means something which is very scarily distorted. So all that which human beings were familiar with appears to be as grotesque. Fourth, there's also a complete inversion of values and beliefs that were held dear before this. So a complete inversion or a change that we notice. Last, we see that these texts carry themes of loss, loneliness, irrationality, confusion, some kind of a hopelessness as well, right? So these are some of the features of the texts belonging to the theatre of the absurd, right? So we have seen that this text, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which is a seminal text belonging to the movement theatre of the absurd. What's the philosophy which will be behind it? What are the formal features that we can expect this play to have, and what was the background against which this kind of a text came into being? These are some of the things that we have seen so far. We'll make one more point about this text, that you see written in 1960s. Even as it carries this, essence of existentialism, we also see that, and it's a adaptation of, or one can say it's a rewriting of a part of Shakespeare's Hamlet. At the same time, it's also said that, if you read the play, that there are echoes of the play Waiting for Godot, right? So you will notice that there are some reflections of that play in this one as well. So most obviously, both these texts are seminal texts which belong to the theatre of the absurd, right? So what have we seen in this lecture? First, we have noticed that how Tom Stoppard is a seminal playwright and a screenwriter who has been prolific. We've seen that the text in discussion is a play which is a rewriting of Shakespeare's Hamlet. Hamlet, which was written in the Elizabethan times, 16th, 17th century, now is being rewritten by Stoppard in the 1960s. So that rewriting, what does it bring to the table? What does it achieve? Is something we're going to discuss in the next lecture. Thereafter, we went on to state that how this is a play which is an existential, tragicomedy, absurdist existential tragicomedy, which defines its genre. Then we discussed about the theatre of the absurd, and we also talked at length about the existential philosophy, which is at the heart of theatre of the absurd, right? So these are some of the things which we need to keep in mind about this play, and in the next lecture we will make some important points about the text and connect these concerns that we have just now referred to. Thank you.